The crisp autumn air bit at my cheeks as I walked down the dimly lit street toward home. My coat did little to shield me from the chill, but I barely noticed. My thoughts were too tangled, too restless. The house came into view, its dark silhouette framed by the streetlights, and a familiar heaviness settled over me. That house. My house. Our house. For years, it had been a haven, a place of comfort and love. But lately, something had changed. Or maybe I had changed. I tightened my grip on my bag as I approached the door. Mark was probably inside, lounging on the couch or lost in a book, just as he always was when I got home late. Mark, my stepson, though calling him that always felt strange. I had raised him since he was 8, after his mother's passing and then my marriage to his father. And after his father died, it had been just the two of us, holding each other up through the grief. He wasn't a boy anymore though. At 22, Mark had grown into a man, strong, thoughtful, and so much like his father that sometimes it hurt to look at him. But it wasn't just the resemblance that unsettled me these days. It was the way he looked at me, the way he lingered in the room when I was there, the way my own heart seemed to falter whenever our eyes met. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The warmth of the house wrapped around me like a blanket, and there he was, stretched out on the couch with a book in his hands. He looked up as I entered, his dark eyes locking onto mine. "Hey," he said, his voice soft, familiar. "Hey," I replied, setting my bag down and unbuttoning my coat. "How was your day?" "Quiet," he said, closing the book and setting it on the coffee table. "How about you?" "Busy." I managed a small smile, though my heart was pounding. His gaze lingered on me, and I felt exposed, like he could see every thought racing through my mind. Dinner was the same as always, comfortable, easy. We talked about mundane things, the errands I'd run, the project he was working on, the weather. But beneath the surface, there was a tension, an unspoken something that neither of us dared to address. Afterward, I sat on the couch with my knitting, trying to focus on the rhythm of the needles, but Mark joined me, sitting closer than usual. I could feel the heat of his body beside me, the slight brush of his arm against mine. "Laurel," he said after a long silence, his voice low, hesitant. I looked up, startled by the way he said my name. "Yes." He hesitated, his eyes searching mine. I want you to know how much you mean to me." His words caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. "You don't have to say that," I said softly. "You know I love you, Mark." "I love you too," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But there was something in the way he said it, something that made my breath catch. I looked away, my hands trembling slightly as I set the knitting aside. "It's late," I said, rising to my feet. "We should get some rest." Mark didn't move right away, and I could feel his eyes on me as I made my way upstairs. My heart was pounding, my mind racing. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts a chaotic mess. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing between us, something I wasn't ready to face. A soft knock at my door pulled me from my thoughts. "Laurel." Mark's voice was quiet, hesitant. "Come in," I said, sitting up. He opened the door, his expression unreadable. "I couldn't sleep," he admitted, lingering in the doorway. "Neither can I," said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Do you want to talk?" He nodded and stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He sat on the edge of the bed, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice low. "About us. About everything." I felt a knot form in my stomach. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, his eyes fixed on his hands. "I mean, things feel different. Between us. Don't they?" I didn't know what to say. I wanted to deny it, to brush it off as nothing, but the words wouldn't come. I don't know," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Mark looked up, his eyes meeting mine. "I think you do." His words hung in the air, heavy and inescapable. My heart ached, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't fully grasp. Mark, I began, my voice trembling. We can't. I know, he said quickly, his voice thick with emotion. I know it's complicated, and I know it's not normal. But I can't help how I feel. And I don't think you can either. Tears welled in my eyes, and I shook my head, trying to hold myself together. This isn't right, I whispered. I know, he said again, his voice softer now. But it's real. I looked at him, my resolve crumbling under the weight of his gaze. His hand reached out, brushing against mine, and I felt a jolt of electricity. Laurel, he said, his voice barely audible. I need you to be honest with me. Do you feel it too? My heart pounded as I struggled to find the words. I don't know, I said, tears streaming down my face. I don't know what to feel. Mark moved closer, his hand gently cupping my cheek. His touch was warm, grounding, and I found myself leaning into it despite the chaos in my mind. It's okay, he said softly. We'll figure it out. Together. And then before I could think, before I could stop it, his lips brushed mine. It was a tentative kiss, hesitant and full of uncertainty. But it was also full of something else, something I couldn't ignore, no matter how much I wanted to. The world seemed to tilt, and in that moment, everything changed. I woke up the next morning feeling like I'd been caught in a storm. My thoughts were tangled, my emotions raw, and my body heavy with the weight of what had happened the night before. Mark's kiss haunted me, playing on a loop in my mind, both exhilarating and terrifying. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the floor as the sunlight filtered through the curtains. How had I let it happen? How had I crossed that line? I tried to rationalize it, to tell myself it was just a moment of weakness, a mistake born out of confusion and loneliness. But deep down, I knew better. A soft knock on the door startled me. My heart leapt into my throat as Mark's voice came through. Laurel, are you awake? I hesitated, my voice shaky as I replied. Yes. Come in. The door creaked open, and he stepped inside, his expression cautious. He looked like he hadn't slept, his dark eyes shadowed and filled with uncertainty. Good morning, he said softly. Morning, I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. He stood there for a moment, as if unsure of what to do. Then he sat on the chair by the window, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. About last night, he began, his voice tentative. I cut him off, my words spilling out in a rush. Mark, it was a mistake. We were tired, emotional, and... It wasn't a mistake, he said firmly, his eyes locking onto mine. Not for me. I looked away, my chest tightening. It can't happen again, I said, my voice trembling. It's too complicated. It's wrong. Is it? He asked, his voice soft but insistent. Who decides what's right and wrong? We're both adults, Laurel. We're not hurting anyone. His words sent a jolt through me, and I struggled to find a response. It's not that simple, I said finally. We have a history, a connection it's different. It's not supposed to be like this. He leaned forward, his gaze intense. I know our history, and I know what we've been through. But that doesn't change how I feel. And I don't think it changes how you feel either. I couldn't look at him. The truth in his words was too much to bear. I don't know what I feel, I admitted, my voice barely audible. Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. I don't want to make things harder for you, he said. But I can't pretend this doesn't exist. I can't pretend I don't love you, not as my stepmother, but as you. His words hit me like a wave, and I felt my resolve crumbling. But before I could respond, he stood and walked to the door. I'll give you time, he said, his voice soft. But I need you to be honest with yourself, Laurel. That's all I ask. And then he was gone, leaving me alone with my thoughts. The next few days passed in a blur. I threw myself into work, into chores, into anything that would keep my mind occupied. Mark gave me space, but his presence was impossible to ignore. Every glance, every fleeting touch, every quiet moment we shared felt charged, heavy with unspoken words. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, he appeared in the kitchen. He leaned against the counter, watching me with an intensity that made my heart race. "Can I help?" he asked. I nodded, handing him a knife and a cutting board. He started chopping vegetables, his movements steady and deliberate. For a while, we worked in silence, the only sounds the rhythmic chopping and the sizzle of food in the pan. But the tension between us was palpable, and I could feel his eyes on me every so often. Finally, he broke the silence. "Have you thought about what I said?" I froze, my hands gripping the spatula tightly. "Mark, I don't know what to say." "Say what you feel," he said, his voice gentle. I turned to face him, my chest tight with emotion. "I'm scared," I admitted. "I'm scared of what this means, of what people will think of everything." He set the knife down and stepped closer, his eyes searching mine. "You don't have to be scared," he said softly. "We can take it slow. We don't have to tell anyone. We can figure this out, just the two of us." His words were reassuring, but they didn't ease the turmoil inside me. And what if we can't figure it out? What if we ruin everything? He reached out, his hand brushing mine. "We won't," he said with quiet conviction. "Because I'm not going anywhere. No matter what happens, I'm here for you." I looked at him, my heart aching with the weight of my feelings. I wanted to believe him, to let myself give in to the pull I felt toward him. But the fear was still there, gnawing at the edges of my resolve. "Let's just get through dinner," I said, my voice shaky. "One thing at a time." He nodded, a small smile playing at his lips. "One thing at a time," he echoed. That night, after dinner, we sat on the couch, the tension between us lessened but not gone. He turned on a movie, and we watched in comfortable silence. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, because I woke to find myself leaning against him, his arm around me, his warmth seeping into my skin. I sat up quickly, my face flushing. "Sorry," I murmured. "Don't be," he said, his voice soft. I hesitated, my heart pounding as I looked at him. His eyes met mine, and for a moment, everything else faded away. Before I could stop myself, I leaned in and kissed him. It was tentative at first, but as his arms wrapped around me, the kiss deepened, and I felt a spark ignite inside me. When we finally pulled apart, I was breathless, my mind spinning. "Laurel," he said, his voice full of emotion. "Are you sure?" I wasn't sure of anything, but in that moment, I didn't care. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I don't want to fight it anymore." He smiled, his hand gently cupping my face. "We'll figure it out. Together." And for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a flicker of hope. The days that followed were a blur of stolen moments and whispered confessions. Mark and I were cautious, careful to keep our budding relationship hidden, even within the privacy of our own home. Every glance, every touch felt like a secret treasure, something precious and fragile that we had to protect at all costs. At night, when the house was quiet and the world outside seemed far away, we would talk for hours. About our fears, our dreams, our regrets. About everything and nothing. It felt like we were discovering each other for the first time, peeling back layers that had been hidden for years. But the secrecy weighed on me. As much as I cherished the time we spent together, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were living on borrowed time. That sooner or later, our fragile bubble would burst, and the reality of what we were doing would come crashing down around us. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Mark broke the silence. "We can't keep this a secret forever," he said, his voice calm but firm. I looked at him, my heart tightening. "I know," I admitted, "but I'm not ready to tell anyone. Not yet." He reached for my hand, his fingers intertwining with mine. "I'll wait as long as you need," he said. "But I don't want you to feel like you have to hide. You deserve to be happy, Laurel. We both do." His words touched me deeply, but they also filled me with a sense of dread. I knew he was right. We couldn't keep living like this, constantly looking over our shoulders, afraid of what people might think. But the thought of facing the world, of exposing ourselves to judgment and scrutiny, was terrifying. A week later, the first crack in our fragile bubble appeared. It was a Sunday afternoon, and we were in the garden, enjoying the warm sunshine and the scent of blooming flowers. I was tending to the roses, my hands covered in dirt, when I heard a voice behind me. "Laurel." I turned to see my friend Sophie standing at the gate, her expression a mixture of surprise and confusion. "Sophie," I exclaimed, quickly brushing off my hands and walking over to her. "What are you doing here?" "I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd stop by," she said, her eyes flicking to Mark, who was standing a few feet away, his posture tense. "Oh, this is Mark," I said, my voice faltering. "He's staying with me for a while." Sophie raised an eyebrow, her gaze lingering on Mark for a moment before turning back to me. "Nice to meet you," she said, her tone polite but curious. Mark nodded, his expression neutral. "You too." There was an awkward pause, and I could feel Sophie's eyes on me, searching for answers. "Well, I should let you get back to your gardening," she said finally, her tone light but her expression thoughtful. "Let's catch up soon, okay?" "Of course," I said, forcing a smile. "Thanks for stopping by." As she walked away, I felt a knot of anxiety forming in my stomach. Sophie was one of my closest friends, and I knew her well enough to know that she wouldn't let this go. Mark walked over to me, his expression concerned. "You okay?" I nodded, but the truth was, I wasn't. Sophie's unexpected visit had shaken me, and I couldn't help but wonder if it was a sign that our secret was on the verge of being exposed. That evening, as we sat in the living room, I couldn't stop thinking about Sophie. I knew I needed to talk to her, to try and explain things before she jumped to conclusions. "I think I need to tell Sophie," I said, breaking the silence. Mark looked at me, his expression unreadable. "Are you sure?" I nodded, though my heart was pounding. "She's my friend. She'll understand. I hope." He reached for my hand, his touch reassuring. "Whatever you decide, I'm here for you." The next day, I called Sophie and invited her over. She arrived that afternoon, her curiosity barely concealed. We sat on the porch, sipping iced tea as the summer breeze rustled the trees. I could feel her watching me, waiting for me to say something. "Sophie, there's something I need to tell you," I began, my voice shaky. She set her glass down, her expression serious. "I'm listening." I took a deep breath, my hands trembling. "Mark and we're together." Her eyes widened, and for a moment, she said nothing. Then she leaned back in her chair, her expression a mixture of shock and disbelief. "Together," she repeated, her voice incredulous. "Yes," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. She stared at me, her brow furrowed. "Laurel, are you serious? He's your stepson." "I know," I said, my heart aching. "But it's not like that. We're not related by blood. And it's not something we planned. It just happened." Sophie shook her head, her expression conflicted. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. "This is a lot to process." "I know," I said, my voice trembling. "But I need you to understand. I care about him, Sophie. More than I ever thought possible." She was silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Then she sighed, her expression softening. "I don't understand it, Laurel. But I can see that you're serious about this. And if it makes you happy, I'll try to support you." Her words brought tears to my eyes, and I reached for her hand, grateful beyond words. "Thank you," I said, my voice thick with emotion. Telling Sophie was a relief, but it also marked a turning point. I knew that if we wanted to build a life together, Mark and I would have to face the world sooner or later. But for now, we had each other. And that was enough. As time passed, the world outside began to feel less daunting, though the weight of our secret still loomed over us. Mark and I grew closer with each passing day, our bond deepening in ways I hadn't thought possible. Yet, the knowledge that our relationship would eventually come to light filled me with a mix of anticipation and dread. One morning, As sunlight streamed through the windows and bathed the kitchen in a golden glow, Mark set his coffee mug down and looked at me with an intensity that made my heart skip a beat. "Laurel," he began, his voice steady but resolute, "I think it's time." I froze, my hand hovering over the plate of toast I was buttering. "Time for what?" "To tell everyone," he said simply. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. I set the knife down and turned to face him, my chest tightening. "Mark, are you sure? People won't understand. They'll judge us." He reached for my hand, his touch grounding me. "They might," he admitted. "But we can't keep living like this, hiding, pretending. It's not fair to either of us. I want to be with you, Laurel. Out in the open, without fear or shame." His words resonated with something deep inside me, a longing for freedom and authenticity that I had been too afraid to acknowledge. I nodded slowly, though my stomach churned with nerves. "Okay," I said softly. "Let's do it." We decided to start with the people closest to us. My parents were the first. They had always been supportive, but I couldn't predict how they would react to this. When we arrived at their house, my mother greeted us with her usual warmth, her arms enveloping me in a tight hug. My father was in the living room, engrossed in a book, but he looked up and smiled when we entered. "What brings you two here?" my mother asked as she poured us glasses of lemonade. Mark and I exchanged a glance, and I felt his hand brush against mine in a silent gesture of support. "We have something to tell you," I began, my voice trembling slightly. My mother set the pitcher down and looked at me with concern. "Is everything okay?" "Yes," I said quickly. "But it's complicated." Taking a deep breath, I launched into an explanation, starting with how Mark and I had grown closer after he moved in and ending with the truth about our relationship. When I finished, the room was silent. My mother stared at me, her expression unreadable, while my father's brow furrowed in thought. Finally, my mother spoke. "Laurel, this is unexpected," she said carefully. "But you're both adults, and I trust your judgment. If this is what makes you happy, then I'll support you." My father nodded slowly. "It's unconventional, to say the least," he said, his tone measured. "But I can see that you care for each other. That's what matters." Relief washed over me, and I felt tears prick my eyes. "Thank you," I said, my voice thick with emotion. Buoyed by my parents' acceptance, we began to tell others. Some reactions were supportive, while others were less so. Sophie, true to her word, stood by me, though she admitted that it still felt strange to her. The hardest part was dealing with the judgment from people who didn't know us well. Whispers and sideways glances followed us wherever we went, and the weight of their scrutiny was exhausting. But through it all, Mark remained my anchor. He reminded me why we had chosen to be honest, why we had chosen each other. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the stars, Mark took my hand and looked at me with a seriousness that made my heart race. "Laurel," he said, his voice low and steady, "I want to spend the rest of my life with you." Tears welled in my eyes as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "I know this hasn't been easy," he continued, "but I can't imagine my life without you. Will you marry me?" For a moment, I was too overwhelmed to speak. Then I nodded, a sob escaping my throat. "Yes," I whispered. "Yes, I will." He slipped the ring onto my finger, and we embraced, the world around us fading into insignificance. Our wedding was a small, intimate affair, attended only by those who truly supported us. As we stood under the canopy of an old oak tree, exchanging vows, I felt a sense of peace and certainty that I had never known before. The road to that moment had been anything but easy, but it had been worth it. Mark and I had faced the world together, and we had come out stronger for it. As we danced under the twinkling fairy lights, his arms wrapped around me, I realized that happiness wasn't about following society's rules or living up to other people's expectations. It was about finding someone who saw you for who you truly were and choosing to love them, no matter what. And as I looked into Mark's eyes, I knew that I had found that someone. My partner. My love. My home.